Hi folks! This week's topic is the Gospel of John and the Johannine letters, so-called. And so what's going to happen is this lecture is just about John's Gospel, and there's going to be audio for you to press play on each individual slide. Hope you enjoy it. Your textbook gives these little at-a-glance boxes for each chapter, and I've copied in the at-a-glance box for the Gospel of John because these are great. First, your textbook author says that the Gospel of John was probably the last canonical gospel to be written around 90 to 95 CE. But you'll look at that purple arrow that says this is currently being debated. And you can always look at that website, earlychristianwritings.com, to see the full date window that people hypothesize for each text. And if you do look there, it shows that for John and for Luke, there's a wide window of anywhere from 80 for Luke all the way to 130 for Luke. And the window for John there is 90 to 120. So as we've said before, the times when we think the Gospels are written are just guesses based on internal and external evidence. So just be aware that you'll see in commentaries a date range like, oh, John was written from 85 to 95, or oh, John was 100 to 110 is what it was when I was your age, I guess. But the truth is we're not exactly sure. We just know that John and Luke are later than Matthew and Mark, basically. So secondly, it's traditionally ascribed, or the kind of traditional church idea of who might have written this gospel is John, the son of Zebedee. But if you're taking a historical approach, there are all kinds of reasons why that's not very likely. So as usual, we don't know who the author really is, but we do know that this gospel was written in Greek and probably outside of Palestine. John's distinctive among the four Gospels. Few of John's accounts of Jesus' words and deeds are in the synoptics, and few of the synoptic accounts are in John. So remember at the beginning we talked about separating the Gospels into two groups, the synoptics and John. And synoptic is Greek for seeing together. So scholars tend to look at Matthew, Mark, and Luke together and compare them and see them as literarily interrelated, whereas they see John as quite independent because it contains, there's not a lot of overlap in what it contains. It seems to have gone its own way, maybe not even have known about the other Gospels. Next, John has different emphases from the other Gospels. Jesus has these long speeches in John, and they focus on him, on his identity, and on his divine origin. So if you've been reading the Gospels all along, you've already read the whole Gospel in one sitting of Mark, Matthew, and Luke. If you sit down and read John, you'll see this shift toward divinity being really important to John, Jesus as divine. And in all the Gospels, Jesus does miraculous things or wonderful things that we call miracles, but in John these are called signs. So rather than miracles and healings, John calls what Jesus does signs, and of course signs point to something, so they're more used in John as a proof of something. Number 5, John, we think, and we'll talk about this more, used a number of sources when building his gospel. We'll talk about this more, but one of them might be a signs source, like a list of particular miracles done by Jesus. One of them might be a discourse source or a speech source, because there are really lengthy, rhetorically quite fancy speeches of Jesus in John that we absolutely don't see in the other Gospels. And of course there's a passion narrative. All the Gospels have a passion narrative, and John's is quite similar to the ones behind the Synoptic Gospels. 6, every chapter in this book takes a different approach and talks to you about a different method for doing biblical studies. And John, in this chapter, Bart Ehrman kind of practices all the approaches we've done so far, but mostly wants to show you a new approach, which is called the socio-historical approach. A socio-historical approach to a text tries to understand the history of the community that lies behind that text. The thematic emphases of the Johannine author's sources appear to represent different understandings of Jesus, possibly from different periods in the community's history. So what socio-historical approaches have taught us about the Gospel of John is that there's a lot going on around John, and some people even think we can pull apart John's Gospel to see a development of different things that were happening to the community around it. That is one hypothesis, at least. 7. Other hints in the text indicate that the social life of this community affected its views of Jesus over time. We'll talk more about that. And finally, the community, according to Bart Ehrman, evidently began as a group of faithful Jews who came to believe that Jesus was the Messiah, but were eventually kicked out of their synagogue for this belief because it went too far toward Jesus' divinity, which seemed very blasphemous, of course, for monotheists. And this led to an antagonism with non-Christian Jews and to an elevated Christology in which Jesus was thought to be no mere mortal, but totally divine himself. So this is one hypothesis about how the Gospel of John came to be written and what was its catalyst. But just like we said about the dating, this is also up for debate. And there's a very recent book by a scholar named Adele Reinhartz who challenges this very popular scholarly view. So once again, this is something about John that's being debated, and we'll talk about that more. One thing I really love about your textbook is that it doesn't only talk about the contents of each book in the New Testament, but it also uses different approaches, different lenses through which to look at ancient texts, and it talks about those approaches so that you can use them knowingly. And so the approaches we've looked at so far, I believe, include historical criticism, genre criticism, comparative criticism, redactional criticism or source criticism, and the new one we're going to look at today is socio-historical criticism. So historical criticism is just trying to think chronologically, to think of kind of the order in which things happened, and also trying to look at texts in their own context and to think about what their first audience might have, how their first audience might have received the text, and what might have caused the author to produce the text, and all that kind of thing. And we try to look at a text to derive the meanings that would have made sense at the time that it was written. And genre criticism, of course, is thinking about what literary genre is this text. If it's a gospel, for example, then that's a sort of ancient biography that follows certain conventions. So we can look at other texts of the genre and then look at our text that falls into that genre and look at how the text is participating in the genre and using it, and also how it might be deviating from it. And those things can actually tell us quite a lot. And we've looked at comparative criticism, which is particularly for the Gospels. It's laying out all of the Gospels side by side and then saying, how do they compare? What has this author added, or what has this author left out, and what can that tell us about the text, the author, and the meaning? And we looked at source criticism or redaction criticism, and redaction just means basically editing. So that means it doesn't work for every text because there aren't always very obvious sources, but sometimes, including for the case of John, we can look and see tidbits of shades of earlier strata that get woven in. What are a text's literary or oral sources? And finally, today, the new method of biblical criticism we'll be talking about is socio-historical criticism, which means looking for the community situation, the social situation around the text when it arose and when it was first received. Now that we've looked at all 4 canonical Gospels. Each time we've looked at how the Gospel begins and put those side by side to see what the beginning can tell us about the whole book. Now, we talked about Luke last week, who was the only Gospel author to employ a really quite formal Greco-Roman historian's introduction and to talk about his sources and really behave like a formal Roman historian. Now, John has an interesting beginning too. It's also kind of formal, but in a different format. It's almost a poem. It's poetic language, and it's using terms from philosophy, so it's very philosophical and poetic. So in this slide, I put out all 4 beginnings so you could compare them. To talk a bit more about that kind of poetic prologue or beginning of John, we've already learned about genre criticism. And as you know from your textbook readings, the Gospels are a kind of Greco-Roman biographical genre. And if we look at ancient biographies, they use the very beginning to establish the character of the protagonist. So at the outset of the text, they set the tone for who the main character really is. And so look at this poetic prologue in John chapter 1 verses, let's say 1 to 18. They're very philosophical verses and they're very theological. So they're setting that tone for the whole gospel. And using our comparative method, we can ask ourselves, just looking across the beginnings of these 4 biographies, how is John's tone different from the other gospels? So that's something for you to think about on your own. So I want you to think about what it is that John's prologue wants to communicate about its protagonist, Jesus. But without further ado, let's actually read a little bit of this beginning of John to get a taste of what it sounds like. I put the Greek there just for those of you who are also in Greek right now for fun, but if you're not taking Greek, don't worry. That won't be on the exam. So I'm using a translation, the one I told you about, by the scholar who did the New Testament from the Greek in a way that tries to represent the level of the Greek and even to keep sort of rough Greek and mistakes in the original Greek, so that when English readers who don't know Greek are reading the New Testament, they can actually feel the difference in tone and level as though they knew Greek. So that's David Bentley Hart's New Testament, so that's what I'm using for this one. And it goes, in the origin, in the beginning, there was the Logos, and the Logos was present with God, and the Logos was God. This one was present with God in the origin. All things came to be through him, and without him came to be not a single thing that has come to be. In him was life, and this life was the light of people, and the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not conquer it. So what is that word that is brought in and introduced at the beginning of John that usually in English translations gets translated as the Word? In the beginning was the Word, but that scholar has left the Greek and just called it the Logos. What is that about? It's a noun that in Greek just means a word. However, it's also a technical philosophical term. The general meaning of the word logos in Greek is sort of reason or word, but it's also a term from ancient Greek philosophy. And what it means in a technical sense is the orderliness that philosophers perceived both behind and within the entire cosmos. And this term goes all the way back to Heraclitus in the 500s BCE. And then it was really made more well known in antiquity by the Stoics, starting with Zeno, who lived at the turn of the century, the 300s to the 200s BCE. So in Stoicism, the term also meant that kind of almost divine orderliness behind the universe. And the use of that term, that Stoic term logos, was still popular at the time of John's writing in the early centuries of the Common Era. For example, it's used by Philo of Alexandria, who's a first century Jewish philosopher. And in the first century, authors who use this philosophical term tend to mean a divine kind of reason, a divine orderliness that permeates the whole universe but also transcends the universe. So a good translation of logos as it appears in John's Gospel might very well be divine reason. So the author of John's Gospel was definitely aware of this philosophical tradition and of the technical use of the term logos. But that language stops. It's only there in the poetic prologue, and it doesn't pop up throughout John's Gospel. Like some other Gospel writers, when they have a preferred term for Jesus, well, it pops up throughout. But logos is only there at the outset in the poem. However, according to your textbook, the fact that Jesus is identified with this logos does carry through the Gospel in a thematic way. So some of the themes of the prologue do show up throughout the Gospel, even if the word stops popping up. Themes such as Jesus as someone who pre-existed, his kind of human time walking on earth as a man, Jesus as a light, the light of the world, and Jesus as being sent from heaven. Those things continue throughout the Gospel that are implied by the use of the term logos. It's also important to remember, as I said at the very beginning of the module, there are two contexts without which we cannot understand anything in the New Testament if we want to approach it as historians. We cannot expect to understand anything in the New Testament without both contexts, both the Greco-Roman context of the wider ancient Mediterranean world, and within that, the Jewish context. And so I want to also call attention to the fact that logos, yes, it's a concept from Greek philosophy, it's a Stoic concept, but it also harks back to pre-existing Hebrew scriptures, not just Greek philosophy. So there are some verses here, such as Isaiah 55:11, that kind of link to logos in terms of God's word being something that's almost personified and can be effective almost by itself. Some verses in the wisdom literature, such as Proverbs or Wisdom of Solomon, that are there on the slide, also have wisdom or Sophia as a personified kind of aspect of the divine that can act almost independently of God as an agent for creation. We see that happening in the Logos prologue of John 2. And we have something we'll talk about later, the I am sayings in John. When Jesus uses I am a lot in the Gospel of John, which he doesn't tend to do in the other Gospels, that is harking back to a name that was given to God in the Hebrew Bible. I am is a name of God in the patriarchal narratives, and also the very way the Gospel begins. In the beginning. The Greek is en arche. That's the very same way the Greek translation of Genesis begins. At the head, en arche, in the beginning. So the beginning of John is set up to sound exactly like the beginning of Torah. So there are things about that prologue that are very Greek and philosophical, but they're also very in keeping with Hebrew traditions as well. So all of this adds up to something that Johannine scholars or New Testament scholars call the high Christology of John. So that means a very developed, high opinion of the role and nature of who Jesus is. All of that stuff like Jesus as pre-existing, Jesus as being linked with the Logos behind the cosmos, all of that stuff is a little bit different from the rest of the Gospels. Your textbook says on page 176, John is markedly different from the synoptics in both content and emphasis, and with respect to both Jesus' words and his deeds. So when we talk about a gospel or another early Christian text having a high Christology or low Christology, what we mean is in comparison with other early Christian texts. And so John is thought to have a high Christology in comparison with, for example, the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Here are some examples of what we mean by that. Using the comparative method and seeing what did the Gospels share and what's different about them. So, in the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus almost never speaks about himself. And if he does, he uses phrases such as Son of Man or Human One, although it's debated whether he means himself by that or not. Some people debate that. And if he does talk about himself, sometimes he does so very cryptically or even secretly, like tells people, don't tell anyone who I am or who you think I am or what you've seen here. Fast forward to John's Gospel, this is almost the only thing Jesus ever says, talking about himself in really long monologues. So these lengthy philosophical monologues, and the main topic is that he himself is divine. Back to the Synoptic Gospels. In the Synoptic Gospels, there's a lot of action done by Jesus. Casting out demons, healing sick people, blind people, performing miracles that help feed people, etc., etc. So, especially in Mark is almost all action, like exorcisms and healings and miracles, and Jesus explicitly refuses to do this sort of thing as a proof of anything. See Matthew 12:38. Whereas in John's Gospel, there are only 7 miracles, and John chooses to use a word that means signs for these 7 miracles. There's 7 signs, and a sign specifically points to something. In other words, a sign is precisely a proof of something. In this case, Jesus as divine. What is the content of Jesus' teaching in the Synoptic Gospels? He doesn't teach a lot in Mark, just a little bit, but he teaches a lot in Matthew and Luke. And what are those teachings? They're little stories. They're parables. They're little didactic pieces that can be funny, witty, cranky, mysterious, but they're about everyday life, things that would have been around Jesus in Galilee, like yeast and making bread and taking care of sheep and harvesting and all that kind of thing. And the topic of almost all of those stories is something called the Basileia, or the kingdom of God. So Jesus goes around telling short stories that teach about the kingdom of God. You don't see that in John. No parables or stories are there. Instead, Jesus just gives long speeches about himself that are pretty rhetorically fancy and very well thought out. These orations, kind of Greco-Roman orations. That's what Jesus says in John, and they're all about him and his divinity. And then another difference between the Synoptics and John, there are a whole bunch of little differences at the level of plot, or little narrative differences that don't add up and kind of contradict each other. And one small example of that is in the Synoptics, Jesus' trial is done by the Sanhedrin. So that's like a whole council. Whereas in John, Jesus' trial is just alone with the high priest. So there are a bunch of little differences like that. And then finally, what's the upshot of all of this that your textbook is trying to explain? The synoptics have a lower Christology than John's high Christology. When I say lower Christology, I'm talking about the word Christ or Christos, which is like to what extent is Jesus anointed by God, and what does that mean about him? So in the synoptics, having a lower Christology means that Jesus, on the spectrum from divine to human, is very human. He does have special titles, such as Son of God, Deliverer, and Son of Man, but those are all titles that are being used around the audience for humans and have been used in Israel's past as titles for humans. Whereas in John, Jesus is really strongly identified with Israel's God. Almost to the point of being the same being as that God, and he even uses the name I am for himself. So he uses the name of God for himself. So that makes some people think that John is an example of a real turning point in early Christianity, because John is starting to look more like the way Christianity turned out. John's Jesus is starting to look a lot like the Jesus in the later creeds, and the Jesus that Christians today refer to as one member of the Trinity, the God as being three persons in one, and Jesus Christ being one person of that kind of triune or triple God. And when we look historically, sort of chronologically and comparatively, we're not seeing that very well developed in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but it's very developed in John. To talk a little bit more about these so-called I am sayings in John, I took a little snippet out of your textbook. It says, readers have often noticed that Jesus speaks about himself far more in John than in the synoptics. He refers to himself using the phrase I am only 2 times in Mark and Luke, and only 5 times in Matthew. And the verses are all there for you I encourage you to go look at your primary text. If you don't have a New Testament, it's easily Googleable online. Particularly, I encourage you to use the NRSV version. But anyway, Jesus says I am only 2 times in Mark and Luke and only 5 times in Matthew. Contrast this with the Gospel of John, in which Jesus uses that verb to refer to himself 46 times. And among those times in John are 7 particular I am sayings. Note that symbolic number 7 yet again. 7 I am sayings in which he speaks of himself symbolically. So he says I am, and then there's a metaphor. And these are I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. I am the gate for the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I am the resurrection. I am the way, the truth, and the life. And I am the true vine. So all of these special 7 I am symbolic sayings show Jesus as uniquely important as a way, a gate, a path, a means to God and to eternal life. One of these last I am sayings in John 8:58, ends up getting Jesus in big trouble that ultimately leads to his execution and death. He says in John 8:58, before Abraham was, I am. Now that's kind of a weird thing to say. Before Abraham was, I am. And it really harks back to God's name in the Hebrew Bible. So right after he says this, his opponents end up wanting to kill him right there and then for blasphemy. Is Jesus claiming to be God in this saying? Well, the way John portrays it, his opponents definitely think that's exactly what he's doing. And of course, that's absolutely considered to be blasphemous, claiming to be God. Speaking of the number 7, just as there are 7 symbolic I am sayings, there are also 7 signs in John, and only 7. So these 7 miracles that John calls semeia, or signs, include turning water into wine, healing the Capernaum official's son, healing the paralyzed person beside the pool, feeding 5,000 people, walking on water, healing a person who was born blind, and raising someone from the dead, his friend Lazarus. And listen to this from John 20, verses 30 to 31. It's near the end of the gospel. Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. But these 7 are written so that you may come to believe, that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through believing you may have life. So actually the author uses these 7 signs and then comes right out and says, this is why I've included these signs. They point to something I want you to believe, which is that Jesus is the Messiah. And if you look at the whole gospel, it also includes the author wants the hearer to believe that Jesus is divine. The signs are meant to point to something, and they're meant to point to Jesus, the idea of Jesus, of Christ, as divine and as pre-existent, as someone who existed before the guy, Jesus of Nazareth, walked around in the Galilee. One New Testament scholar, Sumney, says John is the only New Testament gospel that clearly teaches the pre-existence of Christ. And Ehrman says, in John, Jesus' speeches focus on his divine origin and divine identity, and his miraculous deeds are signs meant to prove his divine nature. Now let's go back and talk about the other method I mentioned at the outset, which was redaction criticism, or sort of editorial criticism, otherwise known as source criticism, because I did say at the beginning that we talk about this, and your textbook talks about it too. So as I said, scholars have noticed that the author of John's Gospel seems to have woven numerous earlier sources together. What made them suspect that this would be a fruitful type of criticism to use on John? Well, they noticed 3 things in particular. 1, some differences in the writing style. As you move throughout the gospel, if you can read it in Greek, or maybe if you read that translation that I suggested by David Bentley Hart, maybe you could even notice in English, but some shifts in the style of writing depending which part of the gospel you're reading. 2, they noticed a few little repetitions, so redundant accounts, almost like within one part of the narrative, you'll see the same thing said twice a little differently, almost as if the person had 2 accounts, maybe 2 written accounts or 1 written and 1 oral, we don't know, but it seems like they kind of tried to weave more than one account of the same story together and build one narrative out of it. And 3, they noticed something called literary seams. And if you look on page 180 of your textbook, it outlines 5 of these seams. So what are some of these sources that scholars posit behind John's Gospel? One of them is called a signs source. So people think that long before John's Gospel was written, which is around the turn of the 1st century into the 2nd century, somebody had written down various signs of Jesus, the miracles that get woven into John. Secondly, they suggest a discourse source or a collection of speeches attributed to Jesus, these lengthy monologues that I mentioned that Jesus uses to speak and teach about himself in John's Gospel that we don't find in the synoptics at all. Thirdly, there's definitely, as with the other Gospels, a passion narrative, and John's passion is quite similar to the synoptics. So we definitely think that there's a passion narrative that stands behind John's Gospel. And finally, we think that there are probably others. Material original to John, material that comes down through the generations of tradition that's passed on by word of mouth or orally, or maybe other written sources. Check out your textbook from pages 177 to 181 to read more about this. In case you'd like an example of what we call a literary seam, or a little piece of evidence or a little hint that more than one source is being spliced together in an ancient text, there's one at the very beginning. Remember, there's a beautiful poem or poetic philosophical prologue at the beginning of John, and it's all about the Logos. And in the beginning there was this Logos, and this Logos is light and life, and it shines in the darkness. Well, it looks like there's a little snippet about John the Baptist kind of stuck in the middle of a Logos poem. Because if you look at John chapter 1, verses 1 through 14, and this slide has it in Greek, but go ahead and look at it in the English. The part that's in red is just like the other Gospels everyone wants to mention John the Baptist somewhere at the outset. John is no exception. So right in the middle of this passage that's about the cosmos, the Logos, the beginning, darkness, and light, is a different, non-poetic couple of verses about this guy named John. So check that out. That is what I mean when I say a literary seam. It kind of looks like there was one older thing and then a different thing gets plugged in, inserted. So one way that scholars have kind of imagined John's structure and imagined where different things have been woven in is sort of a four-part structure. So first we have the prologue, the poetic philosophical prologue that identifies Jesus with the Logos, and that's put there first to set up the aim of the whole gospel, to tell us in this kind of biographical narrative what the author wants us to think about the protagonist, and that is that this protagonist is identified with the divine spark of reason that lies behind the entire cosmos. And then we move into what source critics call the Book of Signs. So from chapters 119 until the end of around the end of chapter 12, it covers a period of 2 or 3 years of time in Jesus' life, and it has these 7 miracles, these 7 signs. There's more about them on page 171 of your textbook. And during this 3-year window of Jesus' life, some opposition begins. So we start to see people fighting back about Jesus' claims and what he's saying. And then there's a little summary of this whole section in chapter 12, verses 37 to 50. Moving into the third part, according to this one structure that scholars have imagined for John, we then get to the passion narrative. So chapters 13 to 21, verse 23, and this starts to slow down time. So this whole section is actually just one day. It's a single 24-hour period, and it includes Jesus' last meal and instructions to his disciples. It includes what we call one of the big speeches that we call the farewell speech or the farewell discourse. It's the longest of these speeches in John. And we have Jesus' arrest, trial, and execution, and then we have the resurrection narrative. And the section 4, the last bit in this structure is just what's called the postscript. So the very, very end, just verses 24 and 25 of the final chapter. And the last biblical studies method that we will talk about for this book of the Bible, for John's Gospel, is the socio-historical method. So that's a method of textual analysis that looks to reconstruct the social history of the community behind a text. So investigators who use the socio-historical approach are interested in knowing how the historical experiences of an author and his or her social group affected the presentation and the reception of the material. Because the belief there is that the social history of a community, that community's particular experiences, traumas, perspectives, connections, relationships, all of those things will affect the way a community preserves its traditions. Check out page 182 of your textbook to hear more about that. And when socio-historical scholars analyze the Gospel of John, what they usually come up with, ever since the 1970s, when a scholar named Martin came up with this theory, what they usually come up with is some kind of community around John's Gospel that went through a trauma, and we can see the evidence of the trauma unfolding throughout the Gospel, especially if we imagine the Gospel having different layers. And so this is called Martin's synagogue expulsion theory, or the expulsion theory about the Gospel of John. And the three stages of this community's experience, according to Martin, and then many or even most scholars after him, go like this. First, the Johannine community, the community that gave rise to this particular gospel, consisted of a bunch of Jews who followed Jesus. And where did those Jews worship? In synagogues, like everyone else at the time. So there they were in their synagogues, also having this strong affinity for this one rabbi, Jesus, who had convinced them or this or that of something to do with his teachings. Anyway, they followed him. But because of the things that they were saying and believing about this Jesus guy, there came a trauma and a big disagreement in that community. Some of the people in the synagogue were noticing that some of their fellow Jews who were following Jesus were starting to say things about Jesus that sounded a lot like blasphemy. When you start to say, if you're in a monotheistic religion and you start to say, this guy who was executed by Rome, he was God, that's not okay. That sounds like polytheism. And all throughout the history of Israel, the Jewish people have been uniquely adherent to monotheism, very interested in the idea of having one God. Maybe there are all kinds of gods and their God was the best, or their own that they were supposed to follow exclusively, or maybe other gods didn't even exist. Whether it's henotheism or polytheism or monotheism, it's up for debate and it changes over time. But if there's one thing that Judaism has that has been very consistent over time, it's the idea of monotheism. And against that is the idea of idolatry, putting anyone else in the place of God. So if you have some of your fellow Jesus followers, some of your fellow Jews in your synagogue who follow Jesus, who start to say Jesus is God, then obviously this is going to be a huge problem and an issue. Which leads us to stage 3, which caused the trauma that is evident in the Gospel of John. Jewish Jesus followers became hostile towards synagogues like this that had kicked them out or chastised them. And for these people, they actually, faith in Jesus as being somehow divine was more important to them than staying within their community of Judaism. And that is why we see vestiges in John's Gospel of this very hateful language, saying things like the Jews, in quotation marks, because they're all some type of Jew, but there are these angry moments in John's Gospel that say terrible things like the Jews are from their father, the devil. So that is like the third stage, according to the synagogue expulsion theory, where the people who are behind John's gospel actually were kicked out of the synagogue, and in their trauma, they are really angry at those people who kicked them out. And that's why we get these vitriolic passages about the Jews in John. That is just a hypothesis, but it's one of the ways that scholars imagine community and situation and experience behind John's gospel. So putting all of that together, what we learn from John using all these different approaches put together, what we can guess about the aims of John's gospel include things like, this is an overt aim of the author, encourage belief in Christ. And by Christ, this gospel means something really theologically developed, more so than in the synoptics. It means Jesus as not only sent by God, not only God's active agent, but actually beginning to conflate with God and to be somehow divine. And in John's gospel, the desired response, rather than focusing on ethical and social behaviors like maybe more so happens in the synoptics, John's desired response is belief. It's faith. John isn't telling people do this or do that, behave this way, behave that way, live in the kingdom of God like this. John is telling people, believe this about Jesus. Believe Jesus is divine. Believe Jesus is the Son of God. So that's one aim of John, that he even comes out and says, I do this so that you will believe. John doesn't have the eschatological or apocalyptic kind of urgency like the Gospels of St. Mark or Matthew. What is important to John is belief in the present, not acting in a certain way to be ready for some immediate end of the world. So that's another aim of John's gospel. And also, since the 1970s, many scholars believe that one of John's main purposes was to lash out and blame certain Jews for Jesus' death and to justify the Jesus believers, especially the Johannine Jesus believers who believed that Jesus was divine, to justify their own spiritual superiority over those who were still in the synagogues. Now, all of that, I should also say that some scholars are questioning that hypothesis, and right now it's currently quite a big debate for Johannine scholars. So if you want to see an example of someone who works with the Gospel of John who's arguing differently, check out the work of Adele Reinhartz, who is a John scholar, and she challenges the synagogue expulsion view. But I must include it because your textbook includes it, and because it's a really common example of how people imagine John's Gospel arising. So here's this slide again that keeps popping up across various lectures. We'll do a little bit of revision with this slide once again. There are 4 Gospels that made it into the canon of the New Testament, and they were placed at the beginning of the canon, even though they weren't the earliest books written in the canon. And their chronological order is something like Mark, who's written around 69 or 70, and the idea that Mark was the very first Gospel written is called Markan priority. And then that's followed by Matthew, who's maybe in the 70s, maybe early 80s, and that's followed by Luke, who people place in the 90s, although some scholars put Luke last, and then traditionally John was the last Gospel written around the year 100, around the turn of the century, but right now there's a debate. One of the debates is, did John have access to the other Gospels and know about them, or was John totally independent from the synoptics? That's one debate that we don't have the answer to right now. And secondly, the other debate is, which Gospel came last? Was it John as we've always thought, because John has sort of the highest Christology and is the most developed and the most similar to how Christianity turned out? Or was Luke Acts actually the last gospel? The answer is, I don't know, but I'm just telling you that that's what scholars are talking about right now. So that is the conclusion of our lecture on John's Gospel. To go along with it, please make sure you read chapter 11 in your textbook, the one about John's Gospel. But also, the next lecture is about the Johannine epistles. So please also read chapter 12 of your textbook about the Johannine letters before you listen to the next lecture. And of course, you've also got to read your primary text, which is the Gospel of John. So if you've been reading your primary sources all along, then you'll have read the other three Gospels first. So when you launch into John, and try to read it in one sitting if you can, keep your eyes peeled for any difference in tone, any difference in style, difference in the language about Jesus, and then see if what I said in this lecture and if what your textbook said actually makes sense to you. See if you can see it for yourself, and keep your eyes peeled for the 7 I am sayings and for the lengthy speeches that Jesus delivers about himself, and for the signs, the 7 signs. See